And there you go, whole thing also. And then we're recording the whole thing as well. All right, so let's try it again. JSF View Components. Now let's look at an example of using some JSF View Components in an HTML document. Now, JSF tags do have the capability of utilizing and implementing any of the standard HTML functionality. For example, now they're going to look a little different, where we'll have tags that are JSF tags, but they actually will render out HTML tags, such as we're going to implement a HTML form here by way of the HTML JSF tag library. And we have things like adding a graphic image, and we can also set up various panels which will help us to organize some of the content, such like putting in different form elements like input tags and text areas, etc. And we have the ability to utilize EL, or the expression language, in all of these tags. Now this is what we're going to see as far as the output of this section. And you see we'll display a graphic, and we even have a panel laying out the standard HTML page, or at least that it's rendered as HTML to the user. And this is going to be a converter. Oh, these are easy. This is easy. And converters are used to translate between object and string values. An object needs to be translated into a string and sent back to the client. And a string request parameter coming in from our client is translated back to some type of object for us. So we're going to okay, good. Jsf Converters. Now there's a lot of times we want to convert data that's coming from a HTML form that's being submitted from a client, and then we also have data we want to send back to the client. Now first, it's important to note that everything that comes in from an HTML form is coming in as a string, and we don't want to use strings most of the time on the server side. We want to use some type of object. And what happens is we need to be able to translate this between our objects and our string values. So every single object from the server side, before we send it out to a response back to the client, must be translated to a string. And conversely, everything coming back from a form that's posted from a client is in the form of a string, and we want to translate this to some kind of application-specific object. Now, JSF will provide converters for common types such as big decimal, integers, or things like that, and we will be able to do a custom converter of these types, but we can create some other custom converters in the event we have other application-specific objects, such as we're going to look that we're going to implement a custom converter, which is implementing the converter interface, and we will need to implement two methods. One is the get as an object, and the other one is a get as a string. So obviously, getting as an object is going to get the faces context, the UI component that it was associated with, and the string value that's being submitted to it, and we can do any processing we need on that. And the inverse of this is the get as a string, which is still going to take the faces context, the UI component, and the object value from the application, and it's going to convert that value to a string. So now when this is being used in a UI component, for example, we're doing an input text called account number, and what we're going to specify is what converter is valid for this UI component. As we're seeing here, we have the account num converter, which relates to the converter class we've created and is defined by name using the Faces Converter annotation, and we're looking at the account num com name for this, and that's how it's going to pull it up. And now the translation both to and from the value of this input is now going to be converted based on our custom logic. Validators, valedictorian. I keep wanting to say valedictorian anyways. I don't know why. Okay, so okay, cool. Jsf Validators. Now with UI components, we need to ensure that we have valid data from the inputs. And what we are going to do is we're going to use one or multiple validators that we can associate with these UI components to do some standard validation. For example, let's look at this. In this component here, we're going to see we have an input type text and we have a value, but we are going to have a validator message that is specifying what our intention is. This age must be between 18 and 120. And now we can use the F tag to use a specific validator. Now we're going to say we want to validate long range, which is going to need the minimum range, 18, and the maximum range is 120. And this validator must be associated with the tag that, or the UI input that we're associating with, which is age. And as we see here, the input text for this, the ID is age. So we do need these to match. Now, JSF does come with several different custom or built-in validators, not custom, but built-in validators, such as using a double range, a length validator, long validator, and a complex one which I like a lot, which is the regex validator for doing any type of regular expression, and a simple required validator as well. Now, if these standard validators don't work, that's okay. There's no reason why you cannot create your own custom validator by creating a custom class implementing the validator interface. And we must implement the validate method, which will take the faces context, the component that this is expecting to receive the validation from, and the object, which is the value input that was put in. And then you, of course, could do some whatever custom validation you like based on that. And to configure this in the UI component itself, all we have to do is in our input text, now instead of a specific validator type, we're actually just going to give it a validator ID, and it will take the name of the validator that has been registered. And of course, back here, we must end up registering this validator specifically with the Faces Validator annotation, and of course this is going to have the same name as the validator ID that we're going to look for in the tag implementation. configuring the Faces Servlet, so it's probably easy. Yeah, no. Okay, that's easy. Configuring the Faces Servlet. Now, to configure JSF, oh, yes, I'm sorry, now I just, done. Reset. Okay, got it. Configuring the Faces Servlet. Now, in order to configure JSF, we need an entry point, and that entry point is going to be a Faces Servlet, which is acting as a front controller, or also maybe you could call it a gatekeeper. All requests go through this servlet. Now, what we need to do is we need to register this Faces Servlet with our Web Dot Xml, so this would start up. And there's two pieces we're going to use to start. First, we're going to create some kind of name. The name is arbitrary. Call it something that relates to JSF or Faces, and we are going to use this name again. And we need to specify the class that is to be loaded. And we're going to load the javax.faces.webapp.faces servlet as the servlet class. And we want to load one of these instances on startup. Now, this only is going to register the Faces Servlet. In order for it to take requests, we have to define the patterns in which it's going to take requests for. So we're going to set up a servlet mapping for our servlet, which is our name servlet, Faces Servlet, which must match our declaration, and we're going to give it some kind of pattern to listen for. And in here, as we see on this mapping, we're actually saying that all requests to /faces/* will be captured by this Faces Servlet. Now, we can do multiple UI patterns if we like, and we can even do extensions or wildcards as we've seen here. Configuring the framework. Oh, wait. So this was the intro. Oh, we're still in intro? We are in intro. Okay. Whoa, wait, what the heck? Is there enough things on here? Stage, validate XML. Well, really? Why do I, really? How am I doing all these? Should have left them here. Unless, wait, did they have? Oh, okay. Actually, if I'm going to do it this way, do you care if I do this, if I talk about this and then go like that?
I don't care.
Oh, wow, there you go. You're right. Because, again, more value add to me. Or, you know, in my mind, versus me cutting this out. Right, yeah, there you go. So, context parameters can be used to configure the Jsf framework. And we can define a comma-separated list of configuration files. And they're and required when configuring files is not placed in the default location, or not named faces-config. But it's a good idea for larger applications. It's a good idea to split up these files for cleanliness and maintainability. Anyways, all right. So we have several other context parameters. We can actually have the saving state where it's server, which uses cookies, or client, which will use hidden fields. Oops, all right, shut that. And we can also validate if all custom objects can be created on load time, which includes components, converters, renderers, and validators. This way we get a load time exceptions instead of runtime exceptions in the event there's a problem with these objects. Validate the XML and faces config at load time. So we can verify that the faces config is correct. All the faces config is correct. That way, and we can also enable better error messages, including client-side JavaScript. So in development mode, we're going to get more verbose messages, and in production mode, we will get less messages, obviously, and actually reduce the risk of information being leaked and being used as forensics. What kind of shorts again? Something like that. Excuse me. Okay. Good. Configuring the JSF framework in the Web Dot Xml deployment descriptor. Now, context parameters are what we're going to use to set many of the properties that we're going to use in the JSF framework. Now, one of these that we're going to do is defining a comma-separated list of configuration files that we want to be loaded for JSF. And that will be a context parameter called config_files. And there's two reasons for this. One is if we wanted to just change the name and we do not want it to be named faces-config, which is the default. So we can either change the name, or another reason I like to actually do this is adding a parameter with multiple configuration files. This way we don't have everything in one file, and this is going to aid in maintaining those configuration files. Now additionally, we can have a state method. Now we want to know, and JSF wants to know, how are we saving state? We can either use cookies, or we can end up using hidden form fields on a page to actually save the state. Now, if we're going to use the state saving method, we're going to define either server, and this is going to do cookies for us, and session, so it's a server-side session. Otherwise, using a client, we'll just be hidden fields. And other parameters will include a validation. So we can actually validate to ensure that all of the custom objects that you've created, which include components, converters, renderers, and validators, are valid and they're there at load time. And if we want to validate them, we can validate these at load time instead of accidentally getting this exception during runtime. We can also validate the configuration files. By using the validate XML parameter, we can verify that at load time that the faces config file is valid. And additionally, one of the really nice features of this, especially in development, is using the project stage parameter. Now, this is actually going to tell JSF to be more verbose or less verbose in the messages that it will be delivering back to a client. Now, if we're using development versus production, in development we may see very detailed messages, and this is probably too much for the normal user, but as a developer this is great information to help us to debug this. As such, we can see here, if we had a problem, the login page, the link is disabled because a navigation case could not be matched. This is not going to put a lot of validity to the message for somebody who is using this in production. Our customers probably don't want to see this. However, a developer would love to see this to help fix this case. What is it?
That one.
Yep. What? How did you call it?
Creating the management.
Oh, you said your inflection was like what? Okay, there we go.
That was easy.
Huh? What was that? Oh, there you go. Nice. Okay. Oh, now, okay. Good. Creating a managed bean to use in JSF. Now, a managed bean is just a POJO, which really is a plain old Java object. There's not a lot to it, meaning I don't have to implement too many things, but it does have one special thing. It is annotated with the CDI annotation, which is the @named annotation. And optionally, we can give it an actual name that we choose to use for that name. Because if we do not choose a name, as we've seen here, customer, then the default name for this bean will be customer bean, but we're going to have the first letter lowercase. That may not be what we want to use in our JSF pages, so we might want to have a better name that is a little more in line with the use of this, a customer object. And the other optional thing we can do here is we can specify a scope. The default is going to be request scope, but we can choose another scope annotation if we choose. And there is a couple things that you have to be aware of this that's worth noting. First one is it must be implement serializable. And the other thing is that it must adhere to the Java beans notation, which really means that we're going to have the naming convention for all of our member variables, and we must have setters and getters for each of those variables that are to be exposed. Create the web page. Okay, so okay. 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 Creating a JSF web page. Now, in JSF views that we're going to create, they are typically going to be created using an XHTML file, which usually is going to be ended in an XHTML extension or .xhtml. And we're going to specify this as an XHTML compliant document. And we're going to set up one or maybe multiple different namespaces to use within the page. We've set up the HTML namespace as H, and to set this up, it looks similar to a standard HTML page, although again we're using all of the JSF tags, as you can see here, some of the JSF tags, and some of them we're using a mix of standard HTML tags. Now, when we're trying to set up these tags, it is nice to know that when we're writing this, we have access to everything that is in this scope, or at least accessible here, like request as well as session scope, in the way of expression language, or EL. We have access to all the managed beans. So for this, we have access to the customer that was set and all properties of that customer. And this is available for all of the tags that we're using in a given page. Excuse me. I'm gonna try water real quick. All right. There you go. Right. Okay. Good. Explicit page navigation. Now, in the UI components we're using, we can define the navigation rules or outcomes that we want to occur based on the UI component itself. Such if we have a command button and we are going to state that the action for this is to be search. That's the search name that we're using, and we're going to match this in a second. We can also use another attribute such as a link. Well, we'll use the outcome, and we're still going to have a named outcome, or of course a named search. Now, in our JSF configuration file, we can define specific navigation rules, and what we're going to do with those rules is we're going to have navigation cases. And in that navigation case, we're going to look at from a specific outcome. And this will be either from an outcome or even from the action. So both of these would execute this for outcome search, and then it will be navigating to the search employee.xhtml page as that case. Why am I tongue twisting the shit out of this? Jesus. Implicit ones. I implicitly am tongue twisting everything. Wait. Wait. Oh, yeah, well. That's easy peasy. Okay. Wait. Oh, yes, sorry. Okay. Implicit page navigation. Now, when no navigation rules are defined, the navigation itself is implicit. And that means that we're going to use the name of the action or the outcome to try to decipher the page that is to be rendered next or resolved. So if we have, and we're looking for search, then implicitly we're looking for search.xhtml. Or when we're in a managed bean, for example, let's go here. If we did, let me do this. If I've got a command button, and in this command button, I am setting an action that is to be employee.searchEmployees, which happens to be my employee.searchEmployees method. Now what happens is I do know where this is, but on the outcome I'm returning a string, and this string is implicitly going to be looking for a page which is called found, but it's looking for found.xhtml. Form tags. Right. Well, the specific ones. The slides are talking about the UI tag. Wait, what? Define a form. Next, several slides talk about various tags, right? Okay, yeah, right. Let's see what they say here. Okay, this one's going to be intro. No, we're done with that, and we're done this. So, oh, well, okay. So, the demo, walk through how to build it. The next several slides talk about various tags, and these were. Oh, I already did those. Okay, so I already did them. Yeah. And oh, depending on how you do on this slide, you may opt to delete some of. No, I'm not, because I already did them. But that way it makes it easier. Okay, so. Oh, I'll just talk about that. Yeah. So the form tag, the HTML form tag represents the standard HTML form. How about, you know what I don't like? It's like I really kind of want to do this. I always wanted to do this. There it goes. It matches now. Whoa, life makes sense. Oh, yeah, okay, there we go. Okay. The JSF form tag. Now, the JSF form tag, or as we'll see, the H form tag, will represent and is going to be rendered as an HTML form tag. Now, it's worth noting that most UI components will function within the body of this tag as we're trying to have rich content. And it will contain several attributes of changing the look and feel of it, such as, of course, we want to have an identifier in case we have multiple forms on a page. But there's other things that we might want to configure, such as style or style class, as well as things like target, title, or potentially the binding for the backing being for this form. And it also provides JavaScript related event handlers in case we wanted to do something such as on click or potentially the on submit or on reset event handler for this specific form. Yeah. H message. Definitely zooming in on this. Yeah. Right. Look, they got it missing. Perfect. So attributes for defining messages presented that contain attributes that we can define for all of the 4 message types: error, fatal, info, and warn. And we can either display a single message or a list of all messages as a table. Yeah, see here, right? There you go. The JSF message and messages tags. Now, we can have JSF message tags that contain several attributes to define the messages that are presented back to the user in the event that there is some type of information or error or warning that we want to send to that user. Now, each of these messages will have an attribute for CSS where we can configure the way these look individually, such we can have different CSS attributes for error versus fatal versus info versus warning. And we can either define one message at a time, or we can use the messages as we've seen here, using a messages list. And what will happen is we will define this as, it will look something like this. That as we're presenting an error that has multiple, instead of doing one at a time, we might want to show the user everything that's wrong with the form at once. And in this case, we're going to have a username and a password that actually has a validation error. There you go. Using @named. I think we already used @named, but hey, we'll do it again. Oh, wait, this is different. Oh, this is faceless. There you go, right? How funny. It is. We really are. It's all good. It's all good. It's all good. Okay, the @named. Here we go. And this is in facelets. I'm not even going to say the name. That way you can mix and match it. Using the named annotation. Now, the named annotation allows you to give a user or developer specific name for this bean that you want to use. It makes it easier to remember what you're working with and why you might be working with this, kind of acting as an alias for this bean. And it will be accessible, and we are usually only going to use it when we are needing this bean using the expression language. Now, the difference is that when we're creating the @named with no parameters whatsoever, or no attributes, what's going to happen is we are explicitly going to use the name of the class, but it's going to have the first letter of that class lowercase, as we've seen here. So if we were to have this bean, let's zoom in, customer bean with an uppercase C is now referenced in expression language as customer bean with a lowercase c. Now we can also decide to create an explicit name, so it's something we want. This is us creating an alias for this bean. So if we have a bean that is saying customer bean, but we want to reference it as customer, we now have the ability to reference this now customer bean as, it's no longer customer bean, it's now just customer. Again, this might make it easier for the JSF page developers or faceless page developers to utilize that, and it looks clear. Or you can change the name altogether. Now there is a caveat worth explaining and worth paying attention to, because if you're using the @named and you are not defining a name, you have to be careful, because if the name of the bean starts with more than one uppercase, and this is starting with 3, then the letters will not get changed at all. So URI bean will stay URI bean with the 4 uppercase letters. Sometimes that'll be a gotcha when you're first using it, but you can always change that by creating a custom alias name. All right. Creating the templates. All right, okay. Well, Oh, that's easy. Yeah. Okay. Creating the template. Now, when we want to create the template, we are going to use the UI:insert tag to define a named placeholder. So, for example, if we look in here, we're actually creating a placeholder for the title. We're creating a placeholder for the title again, because we can reuse these. They are named, and we can use them as many times as we like. And we're also creating other types of named inserts, and they don't always have to be a simple piece of text. They can be complex pieces of code. And as you see, we can go through and add many of these. And what's interesting about this, remember, we can mix and match these based on the layout that we actually want and grouping these together. Now, there's times that you don't want to force the person implementing this template to have to actually facilitate and provide that insertable placeholder. So in this case, as we see here, we actually have a UI insert that's called footer. Now, in the event that the page does not provide a custom footer that is to be inserted in place of this template, we can actually provide our own default implementation by including what we plan to use in the event somebody does not want to override it. Right. Oh my gosh. Of course, using the template. Okay, so now. That's easy, yeah. Okay. Using the template. Well, once you have a template created, now all we need to do is start adding information to it. So, for example, we actually will have, highlight this, if we actually have this is a portion of a template here, and we'll say we've got a specific section here which is an inserting of a title, and we also have another section which is right here, inserting of content. Now, in order for us to use this, we have to compose a new page, and we're going to do that first by saying we want to compose, like this. We're going to create composition. We want to create this page based on the template, which this is our template, and it is template.xhtml. And then after that, we need to override these certain placeholders, such that we're going to define a placeholder. Remember, we had an insert. Now for this insert, we're going to define what that insert will be. The insert is a name of title, and now we're just going to put in welcome page. A simple string will be replaced both in this title as well as this title section. And next, we also can define complex data that is to be replaced. So here we actually have the content section here, and there it's within a div tag already, but we're going to insert everything else inside of that. So we've defined a content, and this actually will hold additional HTML tags, and all of that will go inside of this div tag at load time. Okay. Because it says resources, but it's like resource management.
That's fine.
Yeah. Different name. Okay. Jsf Resource Management. Now, JSF does provide wonderful resource management, and there's a lot of things it will do, which includes grouping different resources together, as well as providing support for I-18N, which is internationalization, in case we want to support multiple locales of our resources, and it even allows us to version the different resources we're using in the event where we are incrementally changing those resources. Now, dealing with JSF, we'll look in two locations. At first, it will look into a resources subfolder, right, as we've seen here, and we're going to say it's going to look at our web content and the resources directory. And it will also look in another directory, which happens to be the meta-inf. And then we will look for a /resources folder somewhere on the class path. Now, we can also decide to change this information. So if we use the context parameter, which is setting the web app resources directory, we can relocate that directory to someplace else. Here we're going to relocate it to the web-inf directory /resources, and this means that nobody will get access to this except JSF. So actual viewing of these web resources are not made public, essentially removing them from the public view. Oh my God.
Oh, yeah, I was holding that one.
Was it? We're good though, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Last one, but man, that's how you get back. So I actually started, it was kind of interesting. Yesterday I started, wait, did I leave all my, did I leave my little candies here? I thought I had a bag of candies. Oh, no, you know what I did? Oh,
Uh-oh.
I left them back at the hotel and was like, what? Okay, so I didn't want to have another banana, but I guess I'm going to do that because that's just too growly. And let me stop this real quick. Because I'm still live screening, it's too much. I know I only have one, but my stomach's killing me. It's just 2 seconds here. Oh, actually, you know what? If it's 2 seconds, let me just do this real quick. That's all I need.
Well, let's just take a second.
Get it done. No, before you do it, because you're going to mess it up. One left, right?
I'm rendering it already.
Oh, really? Okay. We're stopping.